Hey everyone, it's me again. I'm continuing from my book, The 1910s. I'm sorry that I haven't been doing it as much. I've just been pretty busy with going to job interviews and being with my boyfriend and helping him pack and whatnot because his family's moving. So yeah, now I'm able to have some time to read. Okay, let's continue. The Road to War. Ernest R. May. Europe erupted into war on June 28, 1940, with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. For the next 3 years, the American president Woodrow Wilson steered a tortuous path around and through international incidents in an effort to keep his nation out of the conflict. Eventually, German measures, especially with regard to submarine warfare and a possible alliance with Mexico, pushed Wilson's hand and made war inevitable. A former Harvard University professor and a distinguished historian who specialized in United States foreign policy during the century's first decades, Ernest R. May describes the 3 hectic years from 1914 to 1917, which brought the United States to war and helped end the Progressive Era. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary had been assassinated in Sarajevo. I think that's how you say it. This event has set off a chain of events that within a few months engulfed all Europe in what was to become known as the Great War or the World War. At the outset, American reactions were mixed. Some people, mostly German Americans, took the side of Austria and Germany. Probably a majority favored the alliance of Russia, France, and Britain. Although cultural ties with England undoubtedly accounted for some of this sympathy, Germany's violation of Belgian neutrality to strike out France had profoundly shocked and alienated American opinion. German Chancellor Theobald von Bismarck, I think that's how you say his last name, I'm not sure, contemptuous description of the Solemn Treaty of Neutrality as a mere scrap of paper was widely quoted with disapproval. German atrocities in Belgium horrified Americans. Many agreed with Allied propagandists that the war was one between civilization and barbarism. Nearly everyone had assumed that the war would be short, but after the near miracle on the Marne that checked the German drive against Paris in September 1914, a stalemate developed on the Western Front. It became clear that fighting might go on for months, perhaps even years, and the passions of most Americans cooled. Cases arose in which the Allies too paid scant attention to international law, invoking dubious rules. The British stopped American ships on the high seas and took them into their ports to be searched for contraband. As in the past, Americans were touchy about freedom of the seas. Nevertheless, most Americans regarded the Allies as morally the better. The communist attitude, however, was a mixture of relief at not being involved and conviction that none of the issues in the conflict concerned America. At the outbreak of the war, President Wilson had felt it necessary to exhort his countrymen to remain impartial in thought as well as in action. The administration made it its business to see that nothing disturbed this mood of non-involvement. At first, the chief threat to continuing American neutrality seemed to be that a dispute with the British over neutral rights. Disputes that might get out of hand as they had in 1812. To avoid this possibility became the chief business of certain key advisors. Walter Hines Pace, the American ambassador in London, who wanted the United States to support England in the war. On more than one occasion actually helped the British government reply to complaints from Washington. Submarine warfare threatens the peace. Blech. On February 4th, 1915, however, the Germans suddenly announced that submarines would sink without warning, and any Allied ships found in the waters around the British Isles, pointing out that submarines would not necessarily be able to distinguish between Allied and neutral vessels. The German government urged neutral states to keep their ships out of the zone. Wilson was incredulous. The submarine was a relatively new weapon whose use in enforcing a blockade had hardly been thought of. Undersea raiders first showed they could execute independent missions when 2 German U-boats sank 4 British ships in the North Sea in September 1914. To young German naval officers frustrated by the glory won by the Army, the sinking suggested a concerted campaign against merchantmen. Admiral Alfred von Tripes, the grand man of the German Navy, publicly endorsed this idea and thus gave it some publicity. But if Wilson had read of it, it is likely that he had dismissed it as Allied propaganda. Accepted practice permitted belligerents to stop any merchantman and inspect their papers, and in exceptional circumstances to sink them after first ensuring the safety of crew and passengers. In the case of neutral vessels, the rule was that contraband could be removed, after which the ship could proceed. To Wilson, it seemed absolutely unthinkable that the German government should now disregard the tradition and threaten neutral shipping and lives. State Department legal officer Robert Lansing felt that the Germans had to be reproached in strong language, and he and the president quickly drew up a note warning that if an American were killed or an American ship sunk, the United States would consider it an indefensible violation of neutral rights. In such event, the United States would be constrained to hold the Imperial German government to strict accountability and to take any steps it might be necessary to take. This was the toughest language that diplomacy permitted. The Germans replied at length, promising that they would try to keep neutral ships from harm without formal notification to Washington. The submarine offensive against Allied shipping was postponed and then recommenced under such stringent restrictions that its initial results were unspectacular. But if Wilson felt elation he was perhaps entitled to, it was short-lived. In April brought reports of increasing submarine activity. An American citizen had died in the torpedoing of a British passenger liner, the Falaba. I think that's how you say it. Since he had been on a belligerent ship in a war zone, the case was somewhat ambiguous. Lansing and most of Wilson's advisors felt it violated American rights, and Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan thought otherwise. The president, who was of 2 minds, deferred action. On May 1st, an American ship, the Gulf Flight, was torpedoed, though not sunk. In the panic that followed, 3 Americans died. This is a very serious incident, but the events of the next week quickly turned attention from the Gulf Flight. On May 7th at 3 in the afternoon, a cablegram reached Washington from the United States Embassy in London. The Lusitania was torpedoed off the Irish coast and sunk in half an hour. One of the largest and most luxurious liners afloat, the Lusitania had sailed from New York on May 1st. Among its 1,257 passengers were many prominent Americans. Despite the war, and regardless of the German embassy's warning in New York papers that the British ship was sailing into a war zone, social life aboard ship had been as gay as ever. They don't mean gay as in when 2 of the same gender of people love each other. What they mean here is the old-timey language of gay, which is happy and whatnot. That's what they mean. Okay? Okay, since we got that out of the way, let me continue. Although the captain of the Lusitania had instructed to steer a zigzag course in a war zone as protection against submarines, he regarded them partly because he could not believe that his ship would be attacked. The torpedo struck the starboard bow and apparently blew up a boiler. The giant vessel at once began to heel and sink. In the quarter hour before it went under, there was a frantic rush to the lifeboats. Some 700 got away, but 1,198 passengers and crewmen died. 128 of them Americans. Wilson's diplomatic triumphs. In Washington, almost everyone felt the time had come to hold Germany to the strict accountability promised by Wilson. But Bryan, not additionally fearful of war, saw points on the German side. The Lusitania had carried munitions. The dead passengers had knowingly taken a risk that they could have avoided, but few others in the administration sympathized with his reasoning. The Germans, most agreed, had committed a barbarous crime and would have to pay for it. Wilson went into almost complete seclusion to decide what he should do. 3 days later, in a speech before a group of newly neutralized citizens, he declared, "There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. There is such a thing as a nation being so right that it does not need to convince others by force that it is right." These words provoked fierce criticism from segments of the press, Congress, and the public. However, the note that Wilson sent to Berlin on May 13th was firmer than might have been expected. It demanded an apology, reparations, and assurances that no such incident would occur. To comply, Germany would have to abandon any undersea warfare against merchant shipping. When Berlin's answer arrived 18 days later, it was unsatisfactory, for it practically justified the sinking on grounds similar to those argued by Bryan. Counting the American demands, Germany proposed that the United States enter into prolonged investigation of and debate about whether the Lusitania had carried munitions, had orders to sink submarines on sight, and other matters. Wilson was in a quandary. He had meant every word in his first Lusitania. On the other hand, he had a horror of the obvious alternatives to acceptance of the German position: the severance of diplomatic relations or a message to Congress proposing a declaration of war. Feeling in the country was obviously calmer than it had been immediately after the sinking, and Bryan and a few others in the administration, citing the more moderate climate of public and congressional opinion, were frantically pleading for retreat. When Wilson concluded that the best course was merely to reiterate what he had said earlier, while offering the Germans further time for consideration to make clear to them that he insisted on action. On the following day, the second Lusitania went off by cable to Germany, reiterating earlier demands. It won. The government of the United States is contending for something much greater than mere rights of property or privileges of commerce. It is contending for nothing less high and sacred than the rights of humanity. The Germans again delayed answering, and when their response finally came, it was once more disputous and inconclusive. But meanwhile, secret orders went out to submarine commanders to refrain from attacking passenger-carrying vessels. Wilson saw that his essential demand had, in effect, been met, and he was content not to insist upon more. Apparently, the Germans are modifying the message he wrote to Colonel Edward House, the president's friend and advisor. They must be made to feel that they must continue in their new way unless they deliberately wish to prove to us that they are unfriendly and wish war. This was the line Wilson followed consistently. In August 1915, after there had been some revival of submarine activity, another passenger liner, Arabic, was sunk. Wilson protested again. Despite the impatience of the press and some of his closest advisors, he gave the German government time to consider, and he won from it a public admission that since the Lusitania exchanges, submarine commanders had been given secret orders not to attack large passenger-carrying vessels without warning. There was another lull. Then in the spring of 1916, a French steamer, the Sussex, was torpedoed. This time Wilson dispatched a virtual ultimatum. He went before Congress to declare solemnly that diplomatic relations would be severed unless Germany abandoned submarine attacks on passenger and freight vessels. From Berlin came a pledge that ships would not be sunk without warning or without provision for the safety of passengers and crew. Out of these cries, Wilson had pulled one diplomatic triumph after another. He was so sure that the American position was morally right and so hopeful that, on reflection, the Germans would accept it that he said before them the choice between doing as he asked and inviting war. For some time to come, this policy was successful, but the choice was still Germany's. As the fighting in Europe settled into an interminable pattern of butchery, as weary anger grew, the danger mounted that the Germans might decide for war. The nation edges toward war. From the end of 1914 on, there had been widespread German subversion and sabotage in America, enough to justify several sensational trials and official requests by the American government for recall of a number of German and Austrian diplomats implicated in these incidents. People in the eastern cities who remained pro-German were likely to be regarded as unpatriotic, but even among people who thought of Germany as an enemy, there were few who felt that immediate action was called for. As for the submarine issue, the most widespread attitude appeared to be a mixture of approval for Wilson's stand, delight that the American government could make Germany back down, and doubt that attacks on passenger liners flying Allied flags actually constituted adequate justification for war. The spectrum of opinion included many different views, ranging from those of devout pacifists at one extreme to outright interventionists at the other. In the middle was a large group described by Wilson as demanding two inconsistent things: firmness and the avoidance of war. This was a confusing situation for a president who liked to be at the head of public opinion. Early in 1916, at the height of the spy and sabotage revelation, Wilson feared a swing toward chauvinism that would make it hard for him, in the next submarine crisis, to be patient as in the past. He explained to his private secretary, Joseph P. Tumulty, "If my re-election as president depends upon my getting into war, I don't want to be president. I intend to stand by the record I have made in all these cases and take whatever action may be necessary, but I will not be rushed into war." Only a few weeks later, the pendulum had swung to the other extreme, at least in Congress. Thomas P. Gore, the blind senator from Oklahoma, and Representative Jeff McLemore of Texas proposed that American citizens be required to stay off armed belligerent ships. Wilson fought these resolutions on the ground that the passage would undermine him in his dealings with Germany. After a bitter fight with members of his own party, he was able to whip enough votes into line to defeat the resolutions. Again, there was a shift in public opinion. During the Sussex crisis, which followed hard on the heels of legislative fight, the loudest voices Wilson heard were advocating a tougher policy toward Germany. Loudest of all was that of the man whom he had been for the presidency in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt. Facing the grim prospects that confronted him after re-election, Wilson knew there was little hope of arranging acceptable peace proposals with the Allies. Robert Lansing, who had succeeded Bryan as Secretary of State, warned that overtures for peace carried the risk of an unacceptable answer from the Allies, one that might end with the United States on the side of the Germans. This risk became all the more apparent when on December 12, 1916, Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg surprised the world by declaring that Germany was ready to discuss terms with allies. Nevertheless, Wilson strove to make peace. for he saw no other way to avoid the imminent danger of war over the submarine issue. On December 18th, he sent a note to all the belligerents, asking them to reveal in confidence their conditions for peace. Despite the Chancellor's recent speech, the Germans gave him a vague and disappointing answer. The Allies, on the other hand, returned a full and seemingly precise statement. In an effort to secure greater cooperation by Germany, Wilson went before Congress on January 22, 1912, and delivered a speech addressed as much to Germany as to America. He called for a settlement of all international issues, limitation of armaments, and the opening of the seas to all nations, and a world in which justice and friendly relations would prevail. And he promised that the United States would join other nations in guaranteeing peace if it were a peace without victory. Victory, however, was precisely what both sets of combatants still wanted. Allied statesmen privately expressed scorn of Wilson for not realizing that the defeat and humiliation of Germany must precede lasting peace. On January 31st, the Germans disclosed their minimum terms. These include annexation of parts of France and Russia, a protectorate over Belgium, colonial gains, and reparations. On the same day, Germany also stated that in pursuing victory, unrestricted submarine warfare would be launched. Shockwaves from Germany and Mexico. For nearly 2 years, Bethmann Hollweg had been able to restrain those who insisted that the submarine could win the war regardless of American intervention. But in the late summer of 1916, the Kaiser, despairing of victory, had summoned Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and his Chief of Staff, General Erich Ludendorff, to take the supreme command. Equally, at the end of its road, the Reichstag hoped to vest the two officers with virtually dictatorial powers, including explicitly that of deciding whether or not to embark on an all-out submarine campaign. In early January 1917, Hindenburg and Ludendorff decided to take this step and to let the United States decide whether or not this meant war. The Kaiser and the parliamentary leaders backed them up, and Bethmann Hollweg was helpless. By the last day of the month, the submarines were on station, ready to begin the new campaign. And on that day, the American government was notified that within 24 hours, any and all shipping in the war zone, neutral vessels included, would be treated as fair game. Wilson felt he had to carry out the threat he had made during the Sussex crisis. On February 3rd, he announced to Congress that he had served diplomatic relations. He added, however, that he could not believe Germany would actually carry out such a riskless and reckless campaign. Only actual overt acts on their part can make me believe it even now. During the succeeding weeks, he tried and failed to persuade the German government that it should back down as it had in the past. On February 25th, the British passenger liner Laconia was sunk with 3 Americans among those lost. On March 12th, an American merchantman, the Alcuin, went down, followed within days by 3 other American vessels. City of Memphis, Illinois, and Vigilancia, the Germans had supplied the overt acts. Compounding the shock was the revelation that the German government had opened negotiations for an alliance with Mexico. A message from German Foreign Minister Otto Zimmermann to the German minister in Mexico City had been intercepted and deciphered by the British and passed on by Ambassador Page to Washington. Dated January 16th, it proposed that if the United States entered the war, Mexico should ally itself with Germany on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, Germany's financial support, and understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When Wilson saw this text, his first reaction was indignation. When he learned that it had been sent through Washington over cable facilities which the State Department has specially opened to the German embassy for possible communication about peace negotiations, he claimed, "Good Lord! Good Lord!" After the package was given to the press and its authenticity confirmed, war seemed to become a certainty. Wilson was still not sure, and as Winston Churchill was to recall in writing his history of World War I, the action of the United States depended upon the workings of this man's mind and spirit to the exclusion of almost every other factor. On the day after he received the Zimmerman text, Wilson proposed to Congress that American merchantmen be armed and authorized to fight submarines, and that he be given broad authority to respond to Germany's challenge. Wilson hoped this measure might preserve America's honor without resort to all-out war. But this was not to be. Pacifists and isolationists, led by Senator La Follette, blocked action without filibuster. Although 75 of the 96 senators announced that they would vote for the bill as they could, La Follette's ranks held and the measure died. Then Wilson cried that a little group of willful men representing no opinion but their own have rendered the great government of the United States helpless and contemptible. He soon took matters in his own hands and by executive order authorized the army of merchantmen. What went through his mind in the next few weeks, no one knows. The actual divisions in public opinion were still sharp. Favor of war was confined to a vocal and growing minority, but sentiment for peace remained powerful. The large majority of the people appeared willing simply to trust that the president would make the right decision. They were ready to follow him. Public opinion did not guide Wilson. He had to guide it. What else can I do? Frank Cobb, a newspaperman who talked with Wilson when his travail was near its end, recorded, "For nights," he said, he'd been lying over going over the whole situation, over the provocation given by Germany, over the probable feeling in the United States, over the consequences to the settlement and the world at large if we entered the melee. He said that he had tried every way he knew to avoid war, that if there were any possibility of avoiding war, he wanted to try. "What else can I do?" he asked. "Is there anything else I could do?" On April 2nd, Wilson asked a joint session of Congress to declare war. He had feared that war might put an end to the ideals voiced in his Peace Without Victory address. In his war message, however, he still talked with the fervor of a missionary. He rose above a mere demand for revenge to the vision of a world made safe for democracy. When Congress voted on April 6th, 6 senators and 50 representatives stood out against war. Among them were not only men with German and American constituencies, but also La Follette, George Norris of Nebraska, and others who represented major elements in the progressivism of the preceding decade. They stood out as spokesmen for the idea that America should keep itself perfect in its own institutions and have as little as possible to do with the world in which it lived, but they were few. The large majority in both houses voted enthusiastically for war, and when they did so, an epoch in American history came to a close. In the 1890s, the United States had broken with its self-imposed isolation. Then, for a while, America had concentrated on its national concerns, but now it was isolated no more. Though men would later try once again to recapture the illusion of innocence and non-entanglement, the nation would from that day forward be a force, or at least a presence, in the affairs of all nations everywhere. And the presence of other nations would be felt in American affairs. The burden of power was on the country and could not be shaken. The progressive era had been the last in which the nation lived unto itself. Please rate, subscribe, and comment down below. And if you're on YouTube, please ring that bell notification so you can know when I upload again. And if you're on TikTok, please like and follow my videos. And on YouTube, let's get to 50 subscribers. And on TikTok, let's get to 40 followers. Because once we do that, then I can do something special for you guys. And by the way, please pay for something on either my eBay or Mercari. It would help me out plenty. Okay? Bye. Have a nice Sunday.